welcome back. And we're moving into our first segment this morning. As we previewed earlier, there's a lot happening in Belize City today as we host the CARICOM Mexico Summit. And here to tell us more about what's on the agenda for the summit, we have Colin Granderson, who is the Assistant Secretary General responsible for Foreign Affairs. And we also have Ronald Jackson, who is the Executive Director for CDEMA, which of course is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Authority, agency, that is. Good morning and welcome, and thank you for being here.
Good morning to you. Thanks for having us.
I'm
to your viewers also.
I'm very sure you have a lot of preparatory work that you had to get done, so we appreciate you taking the time to come in and share with the Belizean public just what is being hoped for in the summit today. Yep. And I want to set the background, Colin, with the CARICOM Mexico relations and being able to organize the summit so that it can be as productive as any 24-hour summit can be.
Well, as you said, it does take some preparation. Yeah. And the government and the officials of Belize have played a very important role as the hosts of this fourth CARICOM Mexico Summit. It takes a lot of coordination. On our side, obviously, we're dealing with 14 member states. We put together briefing documents. Working with the Mexicans, we worked on the agenda. We worked also on the declaration, because normally after a meeting of this type, there's an outcome document, so there's going to be a joint declaration. We're still working on it.
Of course, probably till the 11th hour.
Because I'm sure that after the ministers meet on the agenda of the ministers, they, for example, will be looking at technical cooperation has been taking place between CARICOM and Mexico. Looking also, obviously, at the other items on the agenda, disaster management and recovery. We're looking also at perhaps a bit more some international issues. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals, the position, the issues facing small island developing states and low-lying coastal states, which are obviously extremely important issues for us in CARICOM. Then at the end of that meeting, obviously, they will take a look at themselves at the joint declaration. And if they believe that any amendments are required, they will put forward, obviously, their contributions.
And we know that CARICOM is made up of more than just its member states. It's a body of different organizations as well. Tell us about the other organizations that are scheduled to be here today at the summit.
Well, the most important one is going to be precisely CDEMA.
No, I think given the premise that the discussions on disaster risk management and recovery and reconstruction will take, CDEMA will feature in that space, certainly providing some input, some technical feedback, supporting the foreign ministers and ministers in the conversation around cooperation. I'm wondering if it's divine that we're having rain in the southeast and also in the northwest, but certainly it really illustrates the challenge we're facing as a region. And the Assistant Secretary General would have talked about the challenges facing small island developing states and low-lying coastal areas, one of which is the fragile state of our economy and its vulnerability to shocks, climate-related shocks, weather events such as these where we're now seeing extensive rainfall, necessitating flooding in a number of our communities. So CDEMA is one of those regional specialized institutions of CARICOM that provides what we call a regional public good and services in disaster risk management. It's like FEMA but better in a sense, the Caribbean version of it, where we provide also surge support to our member states when they're affected. You would have seen this past September the situation in the BVI, in Dominica and TCI, in Barbuda. And CDEMA would have had to, on the request of member states, mobilize quite a bit of resources, human, financial, and otherwise, including security personnel, working with other regional partners, the regional security systems, the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, the Caribbean Development Bank from the financing side of things to respond to those needs. So just in answering your question, you recognize that it's not just the community of countries but also several specialized institutions leveraging their respective portfolio to support the Caribbean community when required.
Yeah. Now, the opportunity to have our neighbor Mexico on board for the summit. And it's interesting when you think of disasters, especially natural disasters. We know they are still recovering from the massive earthquakes that they have experienced as well. And we, constantly have in our thoughts our own Caribbean brothers and sisters and their efforts in trying to recover from the massive storms that they experienced. How do you use an opportunity like this to be able to reinforce a lot of the messages and commitments that have already been made in terms of mitigating the effects of climate change, in disaster preparedness, especially since you now have real life examples?
Yeah. No, I know the SG will probably speak to it, given his particular space in the broader dialogue at the foreign ministries level and the political level. But I think it's an opportunity where you can convey a shared message. Where Mexico and the Caribbean have experienced similar challenges, are exposed to similar types of risk. Scale is something we can always consider, but it impacts us no matter what size your country is, no matter your economies. And I think given that we're all coastal communities, Mexico is washed by the Caribbean Sea as well, as it also has, I think, the Pacific side. So, and on both ends there are challenges. So Mexico is a part of two of the most hazard-prone regions in the world, the Caribbean and the Pacific. And so there's an opportunity for shared messaging where we can bring certainly the broader community with a common voice to send that message that we have to act. We have to act at home. We have to act globally in relation to the climate change issues and the challenges it presents to our part of the world specifically.
Can you talk to us about current partnerships that are in place? Or current relationships between?
From our side, we have with Mexico working with the Association of Caribbean States, which broadens the scope of partnership, an initiative looking at disaster risk, but more so from risk information. The Mexican government is supporting the implementation of geospatial platforms in many of the Caribbean territories, providing satellite information, helping us to establish our observation stations, because data and information is going to be critical for decision making. So that's one area they're working with us at the moment. But there are potentially other opportunities for us to collaborate on in terms of training in seismic risk management and other areas. As you would have seen in most recent times, they would have had their own earthquake events and something they face regularly. And there's an opportunity for sharing there.
And from the ministerial?
Yes. No, I would add to that. I think we need to take into account the fact that there's been a long tradition of technical cooperation between CARICOM and Mexico. As a matter of fact, Mexico is perhaps one of our oldest partners in Latin America when it comes to technical cooperation, which therefore means that we've been working together in a number of areas, including disaster management, for quite some time. By coincidence, because obviously the date of this meeting was established quite some time ago, and it falls just a few weeks after the passage of Irma, Maria, and after obviously the natural disasters that have also had an impact on Mexico itself. Therefore, the fact that we're having a summit and that a certain number of decisions are going to be taken with regard to, for example, strengthening the technical cooperation. As I said, it's felicitous that the two things have happened, and it's quite clear that a lot of emphasis is going to be placed on cooperation in the area of disaster management, the area of recovery, because both obviously we need to prepare ourselves. Yes. And we need to do as much as we possibly can. We have a fair amount of capacity, a fair amount of experience, but there's always more that can be done, almost more to be done also. So that a meeting of this type, therefore, by bringing the two sides together at the highest level, the level of heads of state and heads of government, it means that it gives a stronger impetus to the coordination that will be taking place.
Yeah. Now, I'd imagine an opportunity that also arises is with the current examples of the disasters that have taken place in both Mexico and the Caribbean. a unified voice in terms of speaking about climate change within the global community is important. I think while working out the Paris Agreement, we know the Caribbean was really able to exert our own powers in being able to explain how we're being affected and having a commitment for allocation of funds. How do you now take this opportunity when you have the heads of state of these regions, of CARICOM and of Mexico, to be able to use that as an amalgamation of forces?
That's an important dimension of the meeting, the political dimension, the international political dimension. In the past, for example, we've asked Mexico to advocate on our behalf. They're a member, for example, at the G20. We don't have a voice there. And we've been able to ask them, for example, to put forward our concerns with regard to what we call graduation. The fact that the majority of the member states of the Caribbean community are categorized as middle-income countries. Therefore, because we are seen as doing well, because of our high GDPs, also because of we do quite well on the Human Development Index, that we have been graduated, which therefore means that access to concessionary financing has become basically impossible. We find ourselves in a situation, therefore, where because precisely of repeated destruction of hurricanes and floods, that we need to get the money, obviously, to be able to repair, to rebuild. And because of the difficulties of access to concessional funding, we have to borrow on the open market, where the rates obviously are much higher, and that also contributes to the high level of debt that most of our countries are suffering from at this moment. Therefore, as I said, from a political point of view, coming together, discussing issues of that type, and we're able to get the voice of Mexico, which is a strong player, very active on the international stage. So, as I said, it strengthens that coming together, that cooperation, not only at the technical level, but also at the political level.
How do you feel events like this translates to the average individual? Because according to a lot of different perspectives, it's difficult to grasp how a meeting of heads who may seem very far removed from the everyday experience, how does that translate into, yes, this is going to be productive, that action document isn't going to be sitting on someone's desk for the next 3 months? How do you ensure that?
Well, I wouldn't say the heads are removed from everyday experience.
True, because
the heads are very much aware precisely of everyday experiences. It's part of being a politician, being sensitive precisely to the welfare of all the citizens of the country. But just to give an example, with regard to technical cooperation, it takes place in a number of areas. There's the area of capacity building. An area where a lot of work has been done in the past is with strengthening our capacity for collecting data, statistics. Very important. If you want to do proper planning, you need to have data. If you don't have the data, you don't have the empirical evidence, then the planning is not going to be as sharp and as pointed as it should be. We are part of Latin America. It's a region which is our neighbors. They speak Spanish. Therefore, the ability of our English speakers to speak Spanish is also important. And therefore, a lot of work has been done, for example, with strengthening the capacity of our teachers who teach Spanish to be able to do it better. Another area of cooperation has to do, for example, the Mesoamerican Infrastructure Fund has been extended to the Caribbean. And for example, one of the major projects undertaken from Mexico under that particular initiative has been the building of a new hospital in Dominica. So you see the link right away between what takes place at the level of heads of state and heads of government and the impact it can have on the ordinary man in the street. The possibility of having, therefore, a better equipped, a more modern hospital to provide better health care to the ordinary man in the street. That's an example among many others.
You know, Ronald, and I think one of the areas that I know is also scheduled for the agenda is looking at non-communicable diseases. And this is an issue that is plaguing the world. But if we look within the Caribbean and even in Mexico, there are some very clear examples and experiences that can be shared. For example, if we look at the sugar tax in Mexico, in Barbados, in Dominica as well, I think we have seen where there have been some efforts made. How do you address a topic like this with heads of state and heads of government, and why is it a critical opportunity?
Well, I mean, I'm not as well placed as my colleagues at CARICOM, but
Yes.
I can say that the Caribbean Public Health Agency has had this on the agenda for quite some time and been briefing the heads and the community around this particular issue. I've been privileged to be in that space in some of the conversation, and the data and the statistics show that it is enough of an issue for us to consider. We're talking about our whole agenda for prosperity within the region. We're talking about our labor force. And so, you know, what the data is showing is that it is enough of a problem. So when we talk about risk, we're not only talking about, you know, those that are driven by rainfall or wind, but we're talking also about the health-related issues and the health-related hazards and how impacting that can be on our society as we try to achieve our development aspirations. So I think it's something that has gained a space and occupied a space in the discussions of the community of heads. And I think it is going to be a very important conversation to have. And you indicated the experiences in Mexico. So I think there's an opportunity for us to collaborate with a challenge that is impacting our part of the world, and to come up with common strategies that can be pursued and resourced to begin to change. And it goes back to the messaging as well. You know, how can we then look at also our public education, public awareness programs to really change the game, so to speak.
If I could just add to that, at the outset you asked about preparations, and I mentioned that we do a briefing document, and obviously the briefing document, it's we get contributions from our specialist agencies. Therefore, we have part of the briefing document covers NCDs. Now, I think what's very important is that at the level of heads, obviously the approach tends to be far more political. But at the same time, the briefing document gives some of the important aspects of a particular issue on which the heads can focus. And in the course of the exchanges during a summit of this type, best practices are underlined. And obviously we do a report at the end of the conference, which means therefore that some of the new ideas that come out of the exchanges are contained in the report distributed also to all member states, and therefore individual member states are in a position to learn and to be able to draw from the reports of the meeting. But once again, as I said, the mere fact that this discussion is taking place at the level of heads, it's extremely important. Right,
they'll be able to hear firsthand the experiences.
All right, but also with regard to follow-up, they're in a position also to ensure that the follow-up takes place.
Now, similarly tied in, if we're talking about health, we know that there is a vulnerability for the islands that have been devastated for diseases to be impacting the persons within those particular areas. So we have disaster-related diseases that quite likely may start to develop in those areas. And we've also seen a trend where there are new and emerging diseases that spread through the region very quickly. And while they haven't been fatal so far, they have shown perhaps a lack of preparedness. How is that assimilated into the conversation? So you talk about NCDs, which are lifestyle changes, and some can be governed by policies, but some are threats that we don't even know what to expect next.
No, I think that is certainly one of the challenges we're facing in the region. You talked about preparedness, and it really then speaks to our surveillance systems and how we have to strengthen those. So it requires investment in strengthening surveillance. It requires investment in the capacity, and it goes also back to data and modeling. So I think some of the things you would be referring to in recent past, the chikungunya, chickpea, the Zika virus, which, if we look at some of the modeling coming into the era when we started it, being impacted by it, there were some signatures, but then it requires, as I said, how we invest locally in taking that data and looking at the modeling. This is one of the areas that is being attributed to the changing climate. So the vectors are increasing because of the increased temperatures. And so going forward in the future, we're going to have to now look at doing some correlation and looking at past seasonal events and looking at the seasonal changes and how this may be causing further increases in some of the what we would call non-traditional or new and emerging threats that we're seeing, and building our capacity to be able to respond to that. I think that with the leadership of CARICOM, working also with a number of other community actors, we're moving in the appropriate direction. But again, here is where collaboration and cooperation and sharing of experiences and good practices, not just between Mexico and CARICOM, the CARICOM community, but also within the community itself, can pretty much change the fortunes going forward. But again, this is a clear example of the ASG spoke about the issue of overseas development assistance and how that is defined. What you're seeing is the fragility of Caribbean development and Caribbean growth, because we're so exposed to so many of these climate-related risks that as 10 steps forward or 2 steps forward can be set 10 steps backward by these kinds of events, whether they are floods, hurricanes, or environmental health. You talked about these issues, but there have been deaths attributed to chickpea and Zika, particularly in individuals who have had other illnesses which were now exacerbated by the virus itself. So I think we need to really look at how, both at the political level, the negotiation level, getting those who are the main contributors to a problem which we didn't start and we have to deal with, to change their practices, so to speak, but also how from the mobilization of resources to allow us to get the sort of investment in areas that we need to strengthen to be able to cope with a problem which we may not be able to stop from happening, so to speak.
Again, keeping in the line of best practices and lessons learned, I know that CARICOM isn't new. It's not a new phenomenon. I think it's an important thing in our community, the strengthening of our voices and our policies. But the practicality of it and the reality of it is sometimes very far removed from what CARICOM is actually supposed to be, especially on a level relating to epidemics that affect each country in a different way. Like for instance, I went to Jamaica this summer, and you get to the airport and there's checks and regarding if you have a recent vaccination, and I went to Barbados and it was nothing. And it's you don't want to remove the sovereignty of a country itself, and you don't want them to feel like they are not autonomous enough to make their decisions as it relates to their people, especially based on the resources that they have, financial and otherwise. How do you ensure that unity moving forward based on the lessons learned and based on the fact that some countries just don't have the resources to implement things like that?
Ronald underlined the importance of coordination. We need to speak to each other. We need to exchange best practices. But what we also do is we try to determine standards. And that all member states try precisely to come up to those standards, regulatory standards, other health standards, and so on. It's quite possible that a particular country may have a particular reason for putting in place the sort of screening that you mentioned in Jamaica. And other countries didn't think it was necessary at that particular point in time. To come back to the earlier question about precisely the spread of epidemics, exchange of information is very important. And because of the fact that coordination, I think perhaps very often when we speak of coordination in the CARICOM setting, we think of foreign policy. But it takes place in a number of areas. It takes place also in functional cooperation. All right, so that with regard to health, the health ministers meet on a regular basis. The chief medical officers also meet on a regular basis. They exchange their concerns, their issues, their ideas, best practices, and so on. And it's a constant activity. So that yes, we may have limited financial resource capacity to do some of the things that we want to do. But at the same time, to give just an example, we've been able to get NCDs placed on the international agenda. All right, which means therefore that by heightening the sensitivity not only within our own region, but at the global level, it means that far more attention is being paid to it. And it also means that the World Health Organization, which one of the specialized United Nations Agency for Health, they're also paying far more attention to it. It means we also benefit in return from that greater focus being placed by the World Health Organization. You know, so it's a very complex interweaving of actions and the positions and policy and regulations
and allocation of resources,
and also diplomacy and application of resources. So it's not a straightforward type of.
Now let me jump into a different topic, because I think if we look at some of the emerging threats, and we've spoken about health issues, spoken about disaster. We also know very closely tied to disaster is the fragileness of the economies in the Caribbean, and being so tourism dependent or even agriculture, and we have the risks of climate change and whatnot. I know that there is to be a discussion in terms of agriculture and trade and looking at opportunities with Mexico. What in the foreseeable future do you see as a benefit of this particular summit and this declaration that will perhaps benefit the Caribbean countries, especially since we're smaller?
I would say the possibility of increasing trade. I think we on the CARICOM side, we need to do far more. The possibility of investment. As a matter of fact, one or two of the paragraphs in the declaration speak to doing a bit more in the area of investment, but also that we on our side we need to be, how shall I put it, to be more adventurous, entrepreneurial, diversify. But not only that, the Latin American market is right there. Yes, there are impediments, whether it's communications, whether it's language, whether it's transportation. But there are several how shall I put it, businesses in CARICOM, in Jamaica, Trinidad, that have been able to penetrate Latin American markets, Central American markets, and we need to do much more of that. Because as you expand your trade, obviously it means that you need to produce more. It means you're creating more jobs. Also, it means more taxes, more revenue for the respective governments. So that we're hoping that coming out of this, as I said, on both sides, yes, we're looking for investment. Mexico has been very dynamic when it comes to its own trade and investment, and we like to see them doing perhaps a bit more within the wider region. So that, as I said, also we need to take advantage of some of the opportunities offered by Mexico. For example, some of the trade fairs, some of the business fora that are organized, and there's also the possibility of our region hosting one of these international fora, bringing therefore entrepreneurs, businessmen, investors from outside. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but we just can't wait for somebody to help us. All right, we have to do it ourselves.
Absolutely.
And what about connecting the dots? So we have a CARICOM Mexico Summit today, but obviously there's the rest of Latin America as well. What of being able to have an all-inclusive approach in terms of Zika, CARICOM, and Mexico?
That approach takes place at other levels. For example, we have the Association of Caribbean States. We also have, obviously, we have a CELAC. We have the United Nations, to which we all belong. But at the same time, for example, in December there'll be a summit between CARICOM and Cuba. In the mountains of the United Nations General Assembly, the secretariats of Zika and of CARICOM met, and the intention therefore is for us to be able to have a meeting at the officials level, leading down the road to ministers and a summit. We have not a Zika-CARICOM Summit for quite some time.
Yeah.
So that, all those efforts to collect some of the dots.
And other emerging threats, or I should say ongoing threats, will the issue of correspondent banking be discussed?
It's going to be there.
Yeah.
It's going to be there. It's one of our priority issues, a major concern for us. Mexico has been very supportive, and the intention is to for their financial people to see to what extent working with our bankers, our finance officials, what else can be done for us to be able to respond to that particular threat. But CARICOM has spent a lot of time in its outreach, in its engagement with third states, raising that issue of de-risking. We've spent a lot of time. The Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, who plays a lead role, he's traveled quite a few miles to get the word across. We worked we met with the regulatory authorities in the United States. We brought to the attention of the UK government and so on. So,
do you feel that any inroads have been made so far?
There's a better understanding of what is taking place. The international financial institutions, the IMF, World Bank, have been sensitized to the problem. They're looking at it. We've brought the attention of the United Nations also. There was a meeting, for example, in July between the CARICOM Secretary General and the UN Secretary General, and that issue came up. And the UN is also paying far more attention to it.
Now, I want to give you the opportunity, before we close off the segment, to be able to speak to the Belizean people and to other people who are tuning in at this time, just about what you're most optimistic about in terms of what will be hammered out in the declaration today.
Most optimistic, first of all, the strengthening of the relationship. As I said, it's been a long relationship. It's been an active one, and as I said, a summit helps to strengthen that. The summit also helps, obviously, to, how should I put it, to give the imprimatur of heads to the decisions that have been taken, and therefore which needed to be implemented, to be followed through. And as I made the point a bit earlier with one or two examples, that through technical cooperation, it is possible, obviously, to have an impact on the welfare of the ordinary man in the street. So that our sense is that, as I said, we have a very good relationship. This is going to further strengthen the relationship. And we believe that certainly with regard to disaster management and recovery, we'll be able to do a lot of work in that particular area because Mexico, because of its own national experience, is very sensitive to that particular issue.
Well, no, I think certainly from where I sit, I think the cooperation within the declaration around disastrous management and recovery is where our focus certainly will be. I'm pretty confident that we will see some commitments to cooperation and furthering the relationship that exists already. I do believe also that because it is so important, the issue of NCDs will also get some attention. So those are two of the things that we'll be looking at from the disastrous management side. But also very optimistic about some of the other issues that the ASG spoke about, because it does impact on the broader community. And I do think that Mexico, given its role at the global level, can also provide some advocacy and support of the Caribbean community in that regard. And so, I hold some optimism.
If I could just add, I hope that the viewers will get a better sense as to what CARICOM does.
Well, we have
and
conversations
how we go
fairly
about it.
often, yeah, fairly often. But I think it's always a great opportunity to have representatives like yourself on set to get the regional perspective, and I think, and especially understanding how Belize fits into it.
Precisely.
So we know there's quite a bit of work to do today.
And just as a plug, I mean, several of your military personnel are going to be joining the team down in Dominica, assisting us with some of the recovery and reconstruction. And
We also have UN representatives that are there from Belize as well, who are helping with recovery as well. And I know you're probably asked this question quite often, but looking at the recovery efforts currently, what is the expected timeline for a bounce back within the areres that have been?
It's going to be long. I mean, if you look at Gilbert in Jamaica in 1988, for those who care, and Ivan in Grenada in 2004, you're talking about a long haul in being able to truly recover from these situations. I think it took Grenada close to a decade to really start to see consistency in terms of their own economic rebound. Dominica was hit by a far more powerful event. 90% of the building stock was either damaged or destroyed at different degrees. The core economies of the country, 100% impact, tourism and agriculture. So I think if we look at that, then you recognize that it's not going to be an overnight fix. It is going to be, but the silver lining is that they can recover, and other countries have shown that you can recover, and it is an opportunity for us to really make right what may have been wrong, but also look at emerging opportunities in terms of the economy. You talked about diversification earlier, so I think even in the midst of the challenges, with leadership and with all of the citizens coming on board, they will recover from this.
You mentioned one of the points that I think is so important as well, the opportunity to rebuild with a view of lessening impacts in the future. That is also one of the opportunities I'd imagine would be looked at.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, in the case of Jamaica and Gilbert, quite a bit changed in the construction industry in terms of using hurricane straps and roof design. Is it perfect? Maybe not, but we have seen where quite a bit of improvement took place in terms of being more resilient against wind and flood challenges. Similarly in Grenada. And I think what we have seen in all of these countries that were impacted was that there are signs that we can build resilient housing, even if it's the most modest of housing infrastructure. Several of those stood up in Barbuda, in Dominica, in the British Virgin Islands. So if we take that and we do the sort of forensic assessment of why did these buildings not sustain damage and replicate that in the reconstruction phase, then we're going to be a lot better off in dealing with these challenges.
And resilience has always been the anthem of Caribbean people anyway. So I'm waiting for the soca version of Why Gilbert coming up.
And is there an estimate in terms of the total damage?
Not yet. I think the work is still going on in the field, but I can tell you it's going to be close to the order of between billions. 5 to 7 billion, in US dollars. 5 to 7 billions of dollars, and maybe even more. But that's sort of the area that things are trending, but the teams are still doing the sort of economic impact assessment. And remember, no, you don't only look at the physical cost of damage. You're looking at the economic impact as well. So that's being looked at now.
I just said that a donor conference is going to be organized at the end of November, and the intention obviously is to see to be able to get some of the resources required to be able to build, to rebuild, but to build back better.
Okay. Well, this will be your second wrap-up, but there's so much more we can discuss. But as we said, we know you have a packed day ahead, and we have other guests waiting as well. But thank you so much for coming in this morning, starting your day early, and we wish you the best of luck today.
Thank you very much. Thanks also for the opportunity.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of the Belize Police Department as we talk about the missing persons policy. That's coming up after the break, so stay tuned.